You begin noticing it in moments that used to destabilize you. Someone criticizes your decision. A conflict unfolds unexpectedly. Plans change in ways you didn't anticipate. Earlier in life, situations like these could create a strong internal reaction. Your mind would accelerate. Emotions would rise quickly. You might replay the conversation repeatedly afterward, analyzing every detail. Why did they say that? Did I respond correctly? What should I have said instead? The situation could stay with you long after it ended. Even if the external event was small, the internal response could be intense. Your mood might shift for the rest of the day, sometimes longer. But gradually, something in this pattern begins to change. The same type of situation appears. A disagreement, a criticism, an unexpected disruption. And instead of the familiar emotional wave, you notice something surprising. You remain steady. You still hear the criticism. You still understand the disagreement. But the internal reaction does not escalate the way it once did. The moment passes, and your emotional center remains intact. At first, this stability can feel unfamiliar. You might even question it. Am I becoming detached? Why doesn't this affect me the way it used to? But what you are experiencing is not emotional numbness. It is psychological integration. Carl Jung believed that emotional instability often reflects unresolved, unconscious material within the psyche. When certain experiences trigger strong reactions, they're often activating parts of ourselves that remain unexamined. For example, if someone carries deep insecurity about their competence, criticism can feel overwhelming. The external comment activates an internal wound. An emotional reaction becomes far larger than the situation itself. The same principle applies to many forms of emotional disturbance. Conflict activates fear of rejection. Uncertainty activates fear of failure. Disagreement activates fear of being misunderstood. In each case, the external event becomes powerful because it touches something unresolved within the individual. Carl Jung described this phenomenon as the activation of unconscious complexes. A complex is a cluster of emotional memories, beliefs, and reactions formed through past experiences. When a complex is triggered, the psyche reacts automatically. The reaction often feels immediate and overwhelming. The individual may believe they are reacting to the present moment, but in reality, they are reacting to accumulated emotional material stored within the unconscious. This is why certain situations once had such strong influence over your emotional state. They activated complexes that had not yet been integrated, but individuation gradually changes this structure. As the unconscious becomes more conscious, those complexes begin to dissolve. The emotional material that once controlled your reactions becomes visible to awareness. You begin understanding your own fears, your own insecurities, your own emotional patterns. And once these elements become conscious, they lose much of their automatic power. Carl Jung believed that consciousness reduces the influence of unconscious forces. What once controlled you from behind the scenes becomes something you can observe, and observation changes everything. Because once you can observe a reaction, you are no longer completely identified with it. Earlier, emotional reactions might have carried you away instantly. Now you notice them as they arise. A moment of irritation, a flash of defensiveness, a brief surge of anxiety. But instead of dominating your behavior, the emotion passes through your awareness. You experience it without becoming overwhelmed by it. This shift often produces a new quality of emotional stability. External situations still occur. Conflict still appears. Uncertainty still exists. But the internal reaction becomes proportionate rather than overwhelming. Carl Jung believed that psychological strength does not come from suppressing emotion. It comes from integrating the unconscious material that once triggered those emotions. When the shadow becomes conscious, it stops controlling the personality indirectly. The individual gains greater freedom in how they respond to life, and that freedom expresses itself as emotional steadiness. You may notice that situations which once felt dramatic now feel manageable. A disagreement becomes simply a difference of perspective. A criticism becomes information rather than a threat. An unexpected change becomes a challenge rather than crisis. Your emotional system becomes less volatile, not because you stop caring about life, but because your identity is no longer fragile. Carl Jung often emphasized that individuation strengthens the inner structure of the personality. The ego becomes aligned with the deeper self, and that alignment creates psychological stability. Your sense of worth no longer depends entirely on external approval. Your confidence no longer collapses under disagreement. Your direction no longer changes with every criticism. This does not mean you become rigid. You can still listen to feedback. You can still learn from mistakes. You can still reconsider your decisions. But these processes happen calmly rather than reactively. Another sign of this emotional stability appears in situations involving uncertainty. Earlier, uncertainty may have produced strong anxiety. You wanted clear answers, clear outcomes, clear direction. But now, uncertainty feels less threatening. You recognize that life naturally contains unknowns, and instead of reacting with panic, you move forward with patience. Carl Jung believed that psychological maturity involves learning to tolerate tension between opposites, certainty and uncertainty, control and unpredictability, success and failure. The mature psyche does not require immediate resolution. It can hold tension without collapsing into emotional chaos. And as this capacity grows, something remarkable begins to happen. The external world loses its ability to destabilize you. Situations still change. People still disagree. Unexpected challenges still arise. But your inner center remains steady. You respond thoughtfully rather than impulsively. You observe before reacting. You remain grounded even when circumstances are unstable. And this steadiness creates a powerful new experience of life. Events that once felt overwhelming now appear manageable. Conflicts that once shook your identity now pass without leaving deep emotional marks. Carl Jung believed that individuation ultimately leads to a personality that is internally structured rather than externally controlled. The individual becomes anchored in their own psychological center. And once that center forms, external chaos loses much of its influence. You are still part of the world. You still experience its challenges. But you are no longer moved by every emotional wave that passes through it. Instead, you stand within those situations with a new kind of calm. Not cold, not distant, but deeply grounded. And that grounded stability marks one of the clearest signs that individuation is taking place within you. Your emotional world is no longer fragile. It has become structured, anchored, capable of remaining steady even when life around you becomes unpredictable. Observe how you respond now when someone else becomes emotionally intense. A disagreement escalates. Someone raises their voice. A person around you becomes frustrated, reactive, or defensive. Earlier in life, moments like this often created an immediate internal response. If someone was angry, your nervous system became tense. If someone was upset, you felt pressure to fix the situation. If someone criticized you emotionally, your mind rushed to defend itself. The emotional atmosphere around you quickly became your emotional atmosphere. This is a very common human reaction. Psychologists often call it emotional contagion, the tendency for people to absorb the emotional states of those around them. When someone is anxious, others become anxious. When someone is angry, others become defensive. When someone becomes reactive, the entire interaction can escalate rapidly. In earlier stages of psychological development, the ego is highly sensitive to these emotional signals. The nervous system reacts automatically. If someone attacks your perspective, you defend it. If someone becomes aggressive, you become protective. If someone expresses frustration, your emotional system rises to meet the intensity. Carl Jung believed that this reactivity often occurs because the psyche is still identified with unconscious emotional patterns. In other words, the emotional energy around you activates similar patterns within you. An angry tone triggers your own defensiveness. A critical comment activates insecurity. A tense situation awakens the fear of conflict. When these unconscious patterns are activated, your response becomes immediate. And because everyone involved is reacting emotionally, the situation can quickly spiral. But something begins to change as individuation deepens. Your emotional system stops reacting automatically to every signal around you. The same intense moment occurs. Someone raises their voice. Someone becomes defensive, but instead of absorbing the emotional energy instantly, you notice something different. You remain calm, not because you are forcing yourself to stay calm, but because the emotional reaction does not take control the way it once did. You observe the situation. You hear what the person is saying, but their emotional intensity does not automatically become your own. Carl Jung believed that this shift occurs when unconscious emotional material becomes integrated. Earlier, external emotional signals triggered internal reactions because those reactions already existed within the unconscious. But when you bring those patterns into awareness, when you confront your fears, your insecurities, your unresolved emotions, they stop controlling your behavior automatically. You still feel emotions, but they do not dominate your response. This is why emotional stability often appears during the individuation process. Your nervous system becomes less reactive. Your responses become more deliberate. You begin noticing emotional energy around you without immediately absorbing it. This does not mean you become indifferent to others. Empathy remains present. You can still recognize when someone is hurt. You can still understand when someone is frustrated. But understanding does not require emotional entanglement. Earlier, someone else's agitation might have immediately pulled you into the same emotional state. Now you can remain grounded while the other person expresses their reaction. Carl Jung believed that psychological maturity involves differentiating between your inner state and the emotional atmosphere around you. In other words, you learn that not every emotion in the room belongs to you. This differentiation creates an entirely new experience of social conflict. Imagine a conversation where someone suddenly becomes irritated. Earlier, your mind might have reacted instantly. You might feel attacked. You might defend your position quickly. Or you might become anxious about the disagreement. Now the same situation unfolds differently. You notice the irritation in the other person, but instead of reacting immediately, you observe. You listen to what they are saying. You recognize the emotion they are experiencing, but you do not mirror it automatically. This ability to remain grounded in emotionally charged situations often surprises people around you because emotional escalation usually depends on mutual reaction. One person raises their voice. The other person responds with equal intensity. The conflict grows. But when one person remains calm, the emotional dynamic changes. Without reaction, the escalation loses its momentum. Carl Jung believed that individuals who have integrated significant parts of their shadow often display this kind of stability. They have already confronted the emotions that once controlled them: anger, fear, defensiveness. Because those emotions have been explored internally, they are less likely to erupt automatically during external situations. This does not mean you never feel emotional disturbance. You still experience frustration. You still encounter difficult situations. But the emotion moves through you rather than taking control of you. Another place where this stability becomes visible is in unpredictable circumstances, unexpected setbacks, last-minute changes, situations that once might have produced stress. Earlier, these events could create a cascade of emotional responses. Your thoughts might spiral. You might worry about the consequences. You might try to regain control immediately. Now, the same situations feel different. You notice the challenge, but your reaction remains proportionate. Instead of panic, there's assessment. Instead of emotional overwhelm, there's problem solving. Carl Jung believed that the integrated psyche becomes capable of holding emotional tension without collapsing into reaction. This capacity creates resilience. Resilience is not the absence of difficulty. It is the ability to remain psychologically stable when difficulty appears. And as this resilience develops, something remarkable happens. Situations that once dominated your emotional state begin losing their influence. The external world continues changing. People continue reacting emotionally. Unexpected events continue happening. But your inner state remains steady. You respond thoughtfully rather than impulsively. You engage with the situation rather than being consumed by it. Carl Jung believed that individuation ultimately creates an inner center that is not easily disturbed by external chaos. The individual becomes anchored in their own psychological structure. And from that center, emotional storms lose their ability to pull you away from yourself. You can witness the intensity around you without becoming the intensity. You can respond to conflict without losing your balance. You can face uncertainty without abandoning your calm. This steadiness does not come from suppression. It comes from integration. The emotions that once controlled you have been understood. The fears that once destabilized you have been confronted. And because of that inner work, the external world no longer has the same power to shake your psychological foundation. You remain present, aware, emotionally alive, but no longer easily moved by every emotional wave that passes through your environment. And that quiet steadiness is one of the clearest signs that your inner structure has become strong enough to remain stable, even when the world around you becomes chaotic. Think about how many situations you used to feel emotionally decisive. A difficult conversation, a harsh opinion from someone important to you, an unexpected change in plans. Moments like these often carried a disproportionate emotional weight, not necessarily because the events themselves were catastrophic, but because they seemed to influence how stable you felt internally. A disagreement could linger in your mind long after it ended. A critical remark could echo throughout the day. An uncertain situation could create hours of mental tension while you tried to anticipate every possible outcome. The external world had a strong influence on your emotional state, and because of that influence, stability often felt fragile. Carl Jung believed that this fragility appears when the ego still depends heavily on external structures for orientation. When identity is still forming, the individual often organizes their sense of stability around circumstances outside themselves, approval from others, predictability in life, clear outcomes, agreement in relationships. When these external conditions remain stable, the psyche feels secure. But when they shift, when criticism appears, when uncertainty emerges, when conflict occurs, the emotional system reacts strongly. The ego experiences these changes almost as threats to its psychological ground. And because of that, it attempts to restore stability quickly. You explain yourself. You attempt to resolve the conflict. You search for reassurance. You try to regain clarity as soon as possible. But individuation gradually reorganizes this relationship between the inner world and external events. Your psychological center begins moving inward. Earlier, stability depended on circumstances remaining favorable. Now, stability begins depending on something else entirely, your internal structure. Carl Jung believed that the individuation process strengthens the inner architecture of the personality. Instead of relying on external conditions to maintain emotional balance, the individual develops a center within the psyche that remains stable even when circumstances fluctuate. This change does not happen suddenly. It develops through experience, through challenges, through the gradual confrontation with your own unconscious material. Every time you face an emotional reaction and examine it honestly, you strengthen that inner structure. Every time you confront fear, insecurity, or uncertainty directly rather than avoiding it, you integrate another piece of your psyche. Carl Jung described this integration as the process of becoming whole, and wholeness changes how the psyche responds to external situations. Earlier, criticism might have destabilized you because your sense of competence depended on recognition. Now you can listen to criticism calmly, not because criticism feels pleasant, but because your identity no longer depends on universal approval. Earlier, uncertainty might have created anxiety because your sense of safety depended on predictability. Now you can tolerate uncertainty more easily, not because you enjoy unpredictability, but because your psychological center does not collapse when the future becomes unclear. Earlier, conflict might have felt threatening because harmony in relationships help maintain your emotional balance. Now you can face disagreement without feeling internally shaken, because your emotional stability does not rely on everyone agreeing with you. Carl Jung believed that when the ego becomes aligned with the deeper self, the individual gains access to a more stable psychological foundation. The self represents the organizing center of the entire psyche. When the ego connects with this deeper center, identity becomes less vulnerable to external fluctuation. You still care about relationships. You still care about your work. You still care about the outcomes of your decisions, but your internal balance no longer collapses when those external elements change. This creates a new experience of emotional strength. Strength not based on resistance. Strength not based on emotional suppression, but strength based on internal structure. Consider how this appears in everyday situations. A disagreement arises. Earlier, the disagreement might have triggered an emotional reaction that lingered for hours. Now the conversation may still feel uncomfortable, but once it ends, your mind releases it more easily. You reflect on what happened. You learn from the interaction, if necessary, and then you move forward. The situation does not continue disturbing your internal state. Another example appears when plans change unexpectedly. Earlier, sudden changes might have created frustration or anxiety. Your mind would rush to reorganize the situation. You might worry about the consequences. Now the same disruption appears. You acknowledge the change. You adjust if necessary. But the emotional disturbance remains brief. Your stability remains intact. Carl Jung believed that psychological resilience emerges when the individual no longer identifies completely with every emotional fluctuation. You still experience emotions, but you also observe them. You recognize that emotions move through the psyche, like weather moving through the sky. They appear, they pass, but they do not define the entire landscape of your inner world. This perspective allows you to remain grounded even when emotional experiences arise. You feel frustration without losing control. You experience sadness without collapsing into despair. You encounter conflict without abandoning your calm. Carl Jung often emphasized that individuation leads to a personality capable of holding opposites simultaneously. You can experience emotion without being consumed by it. You can face difficulty without losing your balance. You can encounter chaos without abandoning your center. And over time, this ability produces something that feels almost surprising. Life becomes less emotionally turbulent, not because challenges disappear, but because your inner structure has become strong enough to hold them. External circumstances continue changing. People continue expressing their opinions. Unexpected events continue appearing, but your psychological center remains stable. You respond thoughtfully. You adapt when necessary, but you're no longer easily moved away from yourself. Carl Jung believed that the final stages of individuation often reveal themselves through this quiet solidity. The individual becomes internally anchored, not rigid, not emotionally numb, but deeply grounded. A person who can experience the full range of human emotion while remaining connected to their own center. And that inner stability creates a remarkable shift in how life feels. Situations that once created chaos now appear manageable. Moments that once felt overwhelming now feel temporary. The external world continues moving, but you remain steady within it. And this steadiness is not something you perform. It is something you're built through awareness, through integration, through the long process of becoming psychologically whole. It is a quiet strength that appears when the psyche finally stands on its own foundation rather than depending on the stability of the world around it. And that strength is what makes you emotionally unshakable. At some point, the change becomes undeniable. Situations that once carried enormous emotional weight now pass through your life without the same intensity. Conflict still happens. Criticism still appears. Unexpected problems still emerge. But something fundamental inside you remains steady. You are no longer thrown off balance by every shift in the external world. Earlier in life, emotional reactions often arrive quickly and powerfully. A disagreement could stay with you for hours. Someone's harsh opinion could make you question yourself. An uncertain situation could create tension that lingered long after the event ended. It was not weakness. It was a natural condition of a psyche still organizing itself. Carl Jung understood that when identity is still fragile, external circumstances can easily disturb emotional stability. The ego depends heavily on the environment around it. Approval brings reassurance. Agreement brings calm. Predictability brings safety. But when these external supports disappear, the emotional system reacts strongly. The individual tries to restore balance, explain the misunderstanding, fix the conflict, control the outcome, anything that returns stability to the situation. But individuation gradually changes this entire structure. The source of stability moves inward. Carl Jung believed that psychological strength develops when the unconscious parts of the psyche are brought into awareness and integrated. Each confrontation with your shadow, your fears, insecurities, and emotional reactions, strengthens the inner structure of your personality. And once that structure becomes solid enough, something remarkable happens. External chaos loses its leverage. You still experience emotion. You still care about outcomes. But those experiences no longer control your psychological center. Your identity stops depending on whether circumstances are comfortable. Instead, it becomes anchored in something deeper, your own integrated self. Carl Jung once wrote, "There's no birth of consciousness without pain." That insight captures the essence of emotional resilience. The stability you feel now did not appear by accident. It was built through difficult experiences. Moments where you confronted your own reactions. Moments where you faced uncertainty without immediate answers. Moments where you encountered your shadow and began understanding it rather than avoiding it. Each of those experiences strengthened the foundation of your inner life. And now that foundation allows you to remain steady even when situations around you become unstable. You listen to criticism without collapsing. You face uncertainty without panic. You navigate conflict without losing your balance. Not because you have become emotionally cold, but because your emotional system is no longer fragile. Carl Jung believed that individuation eventually produces a personality that is internally structured rather than externally controlled. The individual becomes guided by their own psychological center. External events still matter, but they no longer determine who you are. And this internal anchoring creates a form of quiet resilience. You do not need to prove your strength. You do not need to resist every challenge dramatically. Your stability simply exists, calm, grounded, unmoved by emotional storms that once would have shaken you. Before we close, take a moment to reflect honestly. Have you noticed that situations which once overwhelmed you now feel manageable? Do conflicts, criticism, or uncertainty affect you less intensely than they used to? Share your experience in the comments. Someone else reading your reflection may realize that what they once feared was emotional numbness is actually psychological strength. And if this video helped you understand the calm you've been feeling recently, share it with someone who might also be discovering that emotional stability is not about avoiding life's challenges. It's about building an inner foundation strong enough to face them without losing yourself. Because when your identity becomes internally structured, the world around you may still move, but you remain steady within it.